The safe house had no number on the street, no marker except for the creeping ivy that smothered its outer walls like veins gone wild. The door leaned in its frame, swollen with damp, so that entering it required not just a turn of the knob but a hard shove of the shoulder. The neighborhood had forgotten it long ago. To most, it was one of those shells scattered around the city, places children dared each other to enter but adults walked past without comment. Inside, the air was heavier, thick with the staleness of rooms that had not been lived in but were not yet dead. Wallpaper had peeled into curled strips, revealing plaster beneath, cracked like dried riverbeds. A broken radiator sat against the far wall, rusted into a sculpture. The smell was of mildew and dust, but also of something less identifiable, something metallic, faintly sharp. That night, 2 figures slipped in through the door. They didn't waste a word, didn't announce themselves. They moved as if they'd been here before, as if silence had already been drilled into them. The first thing laid down was not money or weapons but maps. Faded city maps, their edges softened by years of folding, spread across the crooked table in the center of the main room. Bricks scavenged from the collapsed fireplace held them in place. Then came the tape reels. Thick spools, black plastic, some still with their cardboard sleeves yellowed at the corners. Dates stamped in block letters along their sides. 1978, 1983, 1994. A span of decades arranged in stacks like family albums. Their weight on the table seemed disproportionate to their size. The figures rehearsed silence like men rehearsing prayer. They did not play the tapes. They simply arranged them, sorted them, sometimes labeling them with fresh scraps of tape. Their movements were methodical, almost reverent. The safe house became more than an empty building. It became a stage and their stillness a performance. And at the center of it all lay a single object unlike the rest, a sealed metal box. Its surface was pitted from age, the hinges dark with corrosion, but its lock was still sound. There was nothing written on it, no names, no dates, except for a faint number scratched underneath as if by accident. The box made no noise when handled, but its presence pressed down on the room like something alive. Whatever these men carried, it wasn't just contraband. It was a record of something someone had wanted forgotten. And the longer it sat on that table, the louder its silence became. The heist wasn't supposed to go this way. The jewelry store on Dorchester Avenue had been picked because of its quietness. It closed at 9, its owner an old man with no family and no appetite for risk. The shutters rattled when pulled down, the alarm system outdated and, according to research, disconnected years ago. Everything about it suggested low risk, high reward. But nights in the city had a way of shifting without warning. At 2 in the morning, the streets were slick from earlier rain. The 2 men moved quickly, masks tight, gloves already damp. A brick through the front window made a sound that seemed to split the block in half. They climbed through, glass crunching underfoot, and in that moment something went wrong. The alarm screamed. It wasn't the ancient setup they'd seen in scouting. It was newer, freshly wired, loud enough to peel paint from the walls. It wailed into the night like a signal flare. Panic set in, not for the loot. They were already grabbing handfuls of rings, watches, chains, but for time. They had minutes, maybe less. When the first cruiser arrived, its siren lights cut across the glass-strewn floor. One thief darted toward the back door, the metal box cradled like a newborn. The other froze just long enough to be tackled, his body slammed against tile, knees in his back. He laughed even then, the chipped tooth flashing as though this too was part of his act. His voice carried across the store in a taunt, "Took you long enough." The one who ran slipped into the alley. Rain-slicked brick walls caught his shadow. Footsteps echoed, then vanished. By the time the second cruiser cut its engine, the alley was empty but for puddles and trash bins. Inside, the arrested man was pressed into cuffs. His wrists bled from glass shards. But still he grinned. Still he muttered. Because even as he was dragged out into the flashing blue and red, he knew one thing. The box was gone, and with it, the leverage to turn his noise into truth. In interrogation, the man was not silent. He spoke with the same loudness he had in the heist, his voice rising and falling with theatrical rhythm. Detectives sat across from him, recording devices spinning, notebooks open. He leaned back in the chair, grinning as if this was all a game. "They're not just tapes," he said. "They're history. You don't know what you've got. You don't know what we've got. They prove things. They talk. They'll tell you more than I ever could." The detectives traded looks. They'd heard it all before, thieves inventing grand stories to give themselves weight. Claims of knowledge about conspiracies, hidden stashes, secret partners. Lies came cheap in the interview room. But his insistence carried a strange gravity. He talked about reels the size of albums, each stamped with dates. He spoke about voices, famous names, buried crimes. He said they had everything cataloged, indexed, as if the tapes were a library of rot no one wanted shelved. "Sure," one detective finally muttered. "And I suppose the Pope's on there too?" The man just laughed. What unsettled the detectives wasn't his claims but the timing. Because even as they brushed him off, news filtered in from the field. The Safehouse had been searched. And while dust and reels had been found, one box was missing. A sealed metal box. The detectives returned to the room, their skepticism less certain now. And the loud man's grin widened. The days following the heist turned the city into a low hum of rumor. News reports covered the jewelry store break-in, but the real story wasn't on the airwaves. It was in the murmurs inside police halls, in the stiff-backed posture of detectives who recognized the shape of something they didn't want to touch. The loud man wouldn't stop talking. He told them about a tape from 1989, a reel marked with grease pencil in handwriting he swore wasn't his. He said it contained voices that would make heads roll. The detectives sat with him longer than procedure required, listening as he spun out names. A former homicide detective, now retired, his face still framed in plaques on the station wall. A pastor whose sermons had filled pews for 30 years, whose voice still carried like thunder on Sundays. At first the detectives dismissed it. Then one by one details lined up. The date on the reel matched an unsolved homicide case. A woman strangled in her home, evidence inconclusive, the file aging in dust. The pastor had officiated her funeral. The detective had filed her case notes. Coincidence, they told themselves. But the thief insisted it was not coincidence, it was proof. He leaned forward in his chair, chipped tooth glinting under the fluorescent buzz, and whispered like he was giving them a gift. "They're all in there. Every tape is a ledger. They didn't just hide bodies. They hid the stories." The detectives pulled the old files. Photographs curled at the edges, reports written in fading ink. They pinned them on a board, red thread connecting dates, times, names. And in that room, under the hum of overhead bulbs, the board began to look like a map of rot. No one wanted to believe him. Belief was dangerous. But even the disbelief grew thin when patterns began to emerge. If the loud man's partner had truly escaped with the box, then those names were no longer just whispers between four walls. They were leverage waiting to be sold. The man still on the run was not as noisy as his partner. He moved quietly, choosing shadows over spectacle. But he was not above profit. Word spread through underground networks. A single reel had been offered for cash. Not the whole box, just one. A taste. Enough to prove value. The buyer was not another criminal but a collector. His home was lined with shelves of books on crime, binders full of clippings, a small gallery of the macabre. His interest wasn't money, it was history, preserved in artifacts others wanted forgotten. He received the real one Friday night. No words were exchanged beyond the transaction. The box was handed over, and the man with the silver watch vanished into the street. The collector poured himself whiskey. He set the reel into his player, the click of the switch echoing in his study. Voices crackled through the static, low at first, then clearer. Men speaking names. Laughter. Instructions. A voice he recognized immediately, one that had spoken from a pulpit only a week ago. His hand trembled around the glass. By Monday the collector was gone. His car sat in the driveway, his lights off, his dog unfed and restless. Neighbors called the police. The study was neat except for the missing reel. No forced entry. No struggle. Just absence. Whispers spread again, not through news but through back channels. People began to lock doors. Pastors skipped appointments. Retired officers refused interviews. The missing collector had touched something raw, and the disappearance was a message. The tapes weren't just evidence. They were a fault line. And the city had begun to shift. The bridge was chosen because it seemed neutral. It spanned the river like a steel scar, its girders rising into the dark, rain sluicing off their angles. The water below roared with storm runoff, a sound that swallowed anything less than a shout. Detectives arranged the meeting. The captured thief was escorted under heavy guard, cuffs cutting into his wrists. He was still grinning, still talking as if the night were a stage built only for him. "You're too late," he told them. "They've already heard more than you'll ever admit." The plan was an exchange. The detectives wanted the tapes. The man on the run wanted his partner freed. It was doomed from the first step. Rain fell harder, blinding. Figures moved at the far end of the bridge, shadows blurred by mist. A briefcase was lifted, lowered, raised again. Shouts cut the night. Then gunfire, sharp cracks muffled by the storm. Chaos unfolded in seconds. Officers scrambled for cover, headlights flared, sirens split the downpour. The man in custody shouted into the confusion, his voice cracking, "They'll never bury it. You'll all hear it." He was dragged back, but his words carried through. Later, under oath, he repeated them, giving testimony about the pattern of recordings, not random but systematic. He spoke of dates catalogued, of voices archived, of blackmail disguised as memory. But his credibility was fractured. He was known for noise, for boasting, for exaggeration. Jurors leaned back in their chairs, unconvinced. The tapes mattered. But the messenger was broken. The last tape appeared without ceremony. No ransom, no demand. Just a file uploaded to a public server, shared anonymously, spreading across forums and message boards like wildfire. The video was grainy, the audio rough. But it was enough. Faces appeared in dim rooms, speaking names, arranging events. Voices matched to men who had sworn their innocence for years. The timeline was undeniable. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't proof that would hold up in a court of law. But it was a mirror held up for everyone to see. And once seen, it could not be unseen. The tapes spread faster than they could be contained. Copies multiplied across servers, burned to drives, whispered in links passed through encrypted chats. In their wake, the last of the safe houses crumbled. Whatever network had kept these voices hidden collapsed under the weight of exposure. The tapes had done what trials never could. They forced the world to look. And in that looking, reputations broke. The safe house was cleared months later. The ivy had thickened, the doorframe more warped than before. Inside, dust reclaimed the table. The maps were gone, the tapes removed, the box emptied. Only faint outlines on the table showed where things had rested, as if the wood itself remembered. Detectives came with gloves and cameras, but what they found was absence. By then, the tapes were no longer singular objects. They had multiplied, uploaded, copied, mirrored across continents. The box had birthed something impossible to kill. Every time one copy was erased, another surfaced. The loud man sat in prison, his voice still carrying, though fewer listened now. His partner had vanished into rumor, his silver watch perhaps still ticking somewhere unseen. The collector was still missing, his house quiet, his name another entry in a growing list of mysteries. The safe house itself remained, but it no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the echoes, to the voices carved into reels, to the memories forced into permanence. In the end, it wasn't bricks or locks or silence that made the safe house powerful. It was what it contained, and what it unleashed. The walls would crumble. The tapes would not.